Okay, welcome to session 8 of the Unfinished Revolution Colloquium that we're holding here. This session is entitled Pilot Outposts of the Frontier, and that frontier has a special meaning that we'll review and go on. And during the day we're going to go through quite a few aspects of what we've talked about before, trying to tie it in with high performance. And there's a high performance in knowledge work and assumedly leading to high performance in all sorts of capabilities. That's the way it goes. So anyway, the fundamental challenge that sort of in this bootstrapping sense is to develop an optimal evolutionary environment for the organizations. And it's sort of looking and say there's a lot of change coming forth in organizations, a lot of change in their environments, and a lot of change in what they're going to have to adapt to, and a lot of change in the way they can work. So these multiple levels of change are coming about. So the evolutionary environment is what we really have to focus on. So we've used the term social organism in referring to organizations of almost any size, just to help get oriented about the evolutionary concept for that. So anyway, the evolutionary process hopefully gets better and better at determining which direction represents improvement. So this has been a lot of years in evolving this thing, so that some of the concepts don't seem to fit in other people's framework about this. So anyway, one of the things we wanted to remind everybody about is that we've been talking about the coevolution of the tool system and the human system, and each of those is quite complex sort of system in itself, and their coevolution is what has to happen. And that you don't just get driven just by the technologies. So especially you don't get driven by technologies automating what we used to do, because there are going to be so many changes brought about throughout our society in the way we work that processes are going to change, and they'll want to look for ways to change your processes and ways of thinking and working so that you can better harness the new options of the technology. So that's one of the things. And then, so we said, simple-minded, you could just put up two dimensions of tool system and human system, although each of them is a multi-dimension vector, so that you don't get just a plane in there when you try to position any given organization in what degree of how far out in the tool systems do they use, how far up in the human systems are they employing. But you can just make a rough guess that our societies throughout the world are distributed something like this. So we say, okay, and the evolution for all the years has been such that there was some boundary that people could sort of anticipate of the way technologies were going to emerge over the coming decade or so, and same with the way organizations could. So evolution was slow, and a lot of it organic. And so we said, all right, but this is what we assume is the kind of thing we're facing now with a technology that's explosive. And it may not be way out there by now, but it's already, you can anticipate things that are going to be available technically that just, wow, how are you going to harness them? And new options for the way people work together and think, etc. So there's this big frontier. We call it the coevolution frontier, because this is what has to happen. You have to work your way not just over here and then up here, but evolving through there. So this is the challenge. And you said, all right, there isn't anybody going to be able to say exactly where we're going to go. Say, oh boy, this is where you belong out there in that space. And it's an evolutionary process because there's so much complexity of inter-reacting kind of evolution and change. So he says, okay, the best I think we could do is to provide an environment in which evolution could take place in ways that just give the maximum sort of ways in which natural sort of adaptation and evolution could take place. So in that, he says, all right, nobody knows exactly where you're going to be. No, it's too complex, see? And so no dictators, no monopolies. And in some sense you say, okay, if organizations are going to change like that and need to evolve, make an analogy and says, okay, how did our cooking and tastes in food evolve? Well, how would they evolve if there were one restaurant in the world? See? He says, oh, well, they've got one marketplace, they just keep them happy enough, etc., and that's all there is to it. So unless you have a lot of them evolving and trying things and communicating and people finding out what's going on, it's gone. So every organism social organism, in order to evolve best, needs the best visibility of what's happening in the world, what's likely to happen, what other organizations of its similar nature are doing, etc., so it can decide and start maneuvering and evolving. So there's a lot of clustering, moving, etc. And the best thing my assumption is, the best thing to provide an evolutionary environment is to maximize the sort of visibility, both of your guesses about what's happening ahead and the case studies and assessment of what's going on today, and the options that are there, and the experiments, how to integrate good ideas so that they have a chance to get forward. And if these things get caught up with proprietary hooks on things, that'd be sort of like, a proprietary hook on the only way you can get a restaurant is to buy the whole thing from one vendor, which he says, hey, wait a minute. So anyway, something has to evolve in that sense, and it's an interesting challenge. So one of these things comes out, this concept of very high performance organizations, and we're assuming that organizations are going to get much higher in their performance, and this is saying that if they don't get higher in at least their collective ability to cope with complex urgent problems, we're in trouble. So anyway, that's the evolution we need to provide in order to help evolve organizations that are smart enough to cope with the kind of complexity that's going to come like that. So my orientation begins as an engineer, see, and say, well, you need to build prototypes and try them and fly them and then test them and assess them and improve and rebuild, etc. So this is evolution of real working organizations. So way back in the 60s about this, it was, okay, our laboratory is going to use it. We live on it every day, and we make it work better and better for us. Then by 1974 we started, in order for the same thing to get real organizations, not just a laboratory and a research institute, we started selling service over the ARPANET for people. And we made a contract with them in such a way that we actually had a B person assigned, and they had to join. We formed a community of them, and we called it the Knowledge Workshop Architect. See? And so the community was the Knowledge Workshop Architect community. And everybody told me, oh, hey, you know what the acronym for that is? Nobody will like that. It's QUACK, see? So the community, in fact, loved it. And so the chairman they elected nominated himself as King Quack. And the cooperation among them was very, very interesting. They'd start talking about the things that they'd like to see improved. One guy says, well, my boss says I could get an extra $30,000 I could plunk into the kitty to do some improvement of this. What should we do? And so one of the other groups said, hey, this is what we'd really like. They all talked it over, and the first guy says, okay, let's do that, the kind of cooperation. So it was just beginning to take off when our world shut on us like that. And never in the commercial world could we get that kind of cooperation, because the commercial owners of our system were telling us, no, don't do that. You guys are from some kind of ivory tower, and all they'll do out there is want us to spend money improving the system. So if we just shut down that kind of user group, then they'll be quiet and we can go on. So anyway, what we learned there was something to say, yes, you really need to build and try and evolve, and you really need multiple units that are evolving in their own way with a lot of communication between them, so we can all look over there and see. Instead of being closed and I'm going to have one up on them like that. Well, if you flounder because you didn't know that somebody else had already tried that and it didn't work, or why. So anyway, this is the kind of thing of engineering, build, fly, test. Research, study, analyze, understand. Engineering, build, fly, test. So it really, I just can't imagine. There wouldn't be any other way we could have gotten in space but build and try. And do lots of assessment and analysis, but have to build and try. If we're going to try to populate undersea with undersea domes, well, you can't go far with people that are going down inside a swimming pool and learning how to live in little domes under there. He says, no, you have to build real ones with people down there really carrying out their full life and what they're going to do. And let's build them and make them work. So that's the case here. So this is what we get in this frontier then. We say, look, we really need outposts. We really need real-life organizations there that are trying to do this. Oh, so General Motors, why don't you move way out there? Oh, wait a minute. Obviously they become practical problems in moving big organizations. But yet little organizations, the little ones, teaching you what? So the kind of way around this ends up with a very a strategic sort of concepts like that. He says, okay, let's call them high-performance augmented teams. And they're specially equipped, specially trained, specially recruited, specially targeted capabilities, and specially deployed. So in order to get that, I don't think it's all enough to say, oh, we got this team of engineers over there and they like to be a team. We're going to turn them into a high-performance team. So, et cetera, et cetera. So the kind I'm talking about is where you say, it's sort of like, I want a Navy SEALs or something like that. I want something where they really stretch to try to do something. So I need them to be recruited for the tasks, specially equipped, specially trained. And then the question of, okay, how do you put them to work? So you say, okay, we've seen this picture before. It says, capability infrastructure. Oh, we're going to turn some group of people into a high-performance team. So what's going to change in this picture? The same picture can represent a high-performance team. It says, oh, good. So we need to have some feelings for where we really start changing, etc. And so, you can do things with just team spirit, team training, all kinds of such as that. But the coevolution needs a chance for some real evolutionary things happening in both sides. So this is why we keep talking about the technology of getting a prototype open hyperdocument system launched so that you can actually get some unusual things happening in there to start learning. So later today I hope to get through into that thing about the sort of a framework that's been generating among us to say how this could get started to do something like that. But assuming it is, etc., then you says, all right, there's another thing. If you're going to create a high-performance team, so how best to invest in creating and using them? So that answer is put them where they can work closely and usefully with important parts of the real working organization. See, this we watched and learned about too. So it's an important consideration because this will provide workaday visibility to other people in the organization as to what this high performance can do. So they should be able to witness things happening and spurring them to upgrade their own capabilities. So we'll talk a little later about actually having capability ratings would be a very important thing to do that. So this is something we've learned about and watched. And it's one of the things that says, I'm not skillful enough with the graphics here to say, well, I'm going to build something that says, okay, the core knowledge work proficiency for any given individual distributed across the organization, so it's going to slant. So it's probably going to make some kind of curve there that I didn't know how to draw it in PowerPoint. But say it's declining. So he says one way you're going to try to do is lift the whole organization at once. He says, boy, where are you going to lift them to? It costs a hell of a lot to move them very far out in that organization. And if you don't have a good idea of where you're going to move them, it's just a huge amount of spent. So here's the idea of getting a small group that's going to be working within the organization that's going to be a prototype pushed out there. So it's just nothing else I've pictured or watched or observed is sort of equal to this. You go to a conference on groupware and they'll say, we got this really neat system for people to work together. So we had 5 or 6 graduate students work on a project together 3 afternoons a week, and here's all the data we took. See? And I'd look at that and says, wow, even that only 3 years or so we had of that experience like that, we just learned that there's just so much more going on inside the organization that's not going to tell you that you could take that system and plug it in someplace. So it's just very important to have it within it. And then it says, well, there are several ways to then start evolving. One, you could say, yes, I can move the whole system. I introduced email, for instance, some years ago, and that'll pull the whole system up. But if I want to really go for quite high performance, I could start with a high performance augmented support teams, and that's the way my head has moved, to say, hey, we're not going to augment the whole design team or something like that. We'll say, look, we're going to put a support team in the middle that's going to help them significantly do their knowledge work by being a support. And the one way thing we could do is start expanding that till maybe eventually more and more of the whole design team is in that mode. Or we can start replicating that and move it down to the marketing team, or even the. I even once got approached by the people that were doing auditing and says, "We got a complex job." Well, I didn't realize that, but yes, I guess you do. So the auditing teams could be augmented to high performance, the marketing teams, the strategic planning teams, etc. So all right. So you have other places to put these high performance augmented support teams like that. So anyway, that to me is just a very significant thing. It's just, it isn't, anyway, it's so central to really learning how to make an evolutionary environment that I can't imagine unhooking it. So anyway, so now this may look familiar, this diagram. In this case, it represents a large parent organization in which you're going to harness a high-performance support team. So you said, great, some capability down inside the capability infrastructure, that's where I'm going to plug in my team. Great, so where? So anyway, it's just, it warrants an explicit goal, explicit role in there, and it says, okay, it's a good thing to do, let's pick it. So I'm going to keep plaguing you guys with this basic diagram because it just so centrally sort of represents a lot of the things. And if you think of all the things going on inside the capability infrastructure of any big organization, and you said, boy, I could put something in here, you realize that some capability down a few levels often gets drawn upon by higher levels capabilities that depend upon them in order to do their higher level things. And says, okay, that's what infrastructure means. So anyway, so that strategic issue inside my organization, okay, we'll take that, but what jobs would they do? So a strategic answer is, well, process facilitation and knowledge integration within the organization's dynamic knowledge repositories. So that just comes up a winner every time in thinking about it. So example payoff, well, it's going to be such that we had it even by 1974 and certainly today, that a high performance helper can just sort of connect and share screens and show you how to do something. And you can watch and see how much faster they can manipulate and do things. And you could say, how do you do it? And he says, well, I've got this whole set of macros or something, and sometime, these things belong to category of capabilities that are several grades above the rating you have now. But if you can work your way up to it, in about 4 or 5 months, you take a next course, etc. And you'll look at that and says, wow, that's sort of like I'm pedaling along on my bicycle with an umbrella over it to keep the rain off, and somebody swishes by in a car. And he says, wow, that's mobility. So the mobility and the capability to manipulate and portray things has just got a huge amount of latitude, of progress to be made. Which a claim like that is one of the problems, though, in trying to talk about this, is how do you get people to sort of get some perception of how much change there could be? And if I can get to it later, I keep trying to make some examples of some of that thing like this. So anyway, that we've seen in this shared screen kind of thing that people could call us up from any place in the country, and the trainer could connect with them and say, let me see your screen. So and the trainer says, okay, I see it now. Show me what you were doing. Oh, I see what you're wrong. Well, there are other ways. Well, for instance, if you pass me the controls, I'll show you. So they pass the controls and then talk it through and show how they do it. And this was just a terrific way of really facilitating people that they start learning. It's amazing how many of them said, I want to, if we'd have a special training class, a lot of them would be clamoring to come. And they'd come into our laboratory during the breaks, during the training, and they'd watch how other people worked. And then they'd come back in our lab and in the training room and says, hey, they were doing things I never heard of before. Well, they're using a higher grade user interface. What? You mean we're learning something that isn't? Well, we were giving you the beginner's vocabulary. The whole class rebelled. No, we want the real thing. So I probably, if we hadn't shown them the difference and started them out with the beginners, they wouldn't have objected, and then they were all gung-ho. If we just laid it on them at the outset of look at all the verbs and nouns and everything else that are arrayed in these things here, it would have worked. But it's an important thing for them to see. So anyway, the bootstrapping too, it just says a strategic thing about giving them dynamic knowledge repository support. So what's more, you said, well, if you have some operational advanced prototype high performance augmented support teams, where to use them? Well, a best investment would be supporting your capability improvement infrastructure as a bootstrapping strategy, things like that. So there are a number of things, and you know, you want to have to get into dialogue, which I miss. So anyway, so going into early dynamic repositories, there are these special focus groups activities. So an intelligence collection and analysis regarding external events and trends of concern. Very important basic one. Scenarios regarding future trends of concern. Oh yes, very important. The current state of the internal capability infrastructure and the improvements that are planning. Oh yeah, we need to have that under control. The current relations with customers, suppliers, partners, improvement planning, etc. Anyway, oh yes, new products, services. So there are quite a few domains of specialized knowledge that any organization's dynamic knowledge repository wants to keep up on. So one of the critical ones, though, we keep talking about is in the improvement infrastructure are these first two, the first three, I guess, right? So we're going to get some special discussion today about that. And we say, look, if you've got a team that's going to really help you with dynamic repositories, then you need to realize that any larger organization really has nested dynamic repositories because, you know, here's the engineering or the sales or the marketing and financial, etc. Each of those groups has to have its own, to operate in its own way like that. So this is what we've been seeing. And yet the whole has to have one. And this brings about this strong need for concurrency in the evolution of them. But also says, okay, where in there would you sort of plug in some higher performance dynamic knowledge repository support? So that's just a very good question. So this is one of the strategic issues that are there to work on. So this is why we said earlier, well, put them into your improvement infrastructure. So anyway, if you're going to do effective bootstrapping, you need effective dynamic knowledge repository capabilities. So you have to learn how to do this better, and you have to learn how to apply that to your capability improvement capability. And this needs to be a core part of what NICs, the networked improvement communities, help their member organizations improve. So it says NICs are there operating, they have members, they've joined together with the C energy to say what's going on and thing. So what a NIC can do for its members is a very important kind of way. It helps them see how they can use dynamic knowledge repositories, etc., to improve themselves. It's just a basic bootstrapping thing before they start working on other capabilities that the members say they want. You know, I want better communications with my customers, or I want a better source of leather for the shoes I'm building, etc. So those other capabilities need attention too, but the one that really has the strategic leverage is the capability to improve. And the core in that is your collective IQ, the Kodiak capabilities. And the core of that is the dynamic knowledge repository, etc. So anyway, so effective scenario capacity that really needs that. So anyway, for the scale and the rate of change that the unfinished revolution needs to prepare for, this knowledge product part of the dynamic knowledge repositories of the many critical social organisms needs the best possible up-to-date look-ahead scenarios. So how to do that is very important. So we are sort of handy now. We have a talk prepared by Rod Swigert from the Institute for the Future, who's been a specialist for many years in developing and portraying scenarios. And while one thing we had to do was switch laptops in order to make the transition go, which comes down to an absent-minded old man who forgot to prepare his laptop before he came. So anyway, you have a microphone?
I think it's here.
So we've had these basic pictures of what your dynamic knowledge repository would be for since the early 80s. So some of the papers on our website go back there and actually describe them. One of them talks about special kinds of communities, mission-oriented communities and discipline-oriented communities, and that like an individual, a community would have a community knowledge workshop, and if they're distributed, it has to be a knowledge workshop with special characteristics. So because distributed knowledge work is going to be so critical to all the issues we're talking about, that becomes a really central point. And do you want to start talking without slides?
I can start talking. Oh, we got him.
Good.
Okay, thanks. Okay, I'm primarily interested in storytelling. I come to this not as an engineer, but as a fiction writer, and with an interest in what's going to happen, because human beings have always wanted to know what was going to happen. And one of the tools that a lot of people use in business environments and in our research is the scenario process. How many people here, besides Marcelo, are familiar with scenario planning? There's quite a few. Okay, so I'll skim over this stuff pretty fast because I'm interested in my addition to it. And I'm a Mac person. I get one or the other, is that it?
I think that's right.
Okay. Well, at least we get that one. Okay, so very briefly then, what is a scenario? When you start to get a team together to build a scenario, you want to have a lot of different people with a lot of different input beginning to generate a story. So people will start to say, well, if such and such happens, then this will happen. And you get a little snippet of a story, just a little cause and effect relationship. And you collect a lot of those and you start to condense them together, and your snippets begin to build into a storyline. And you try to say, this is all of these factors begin to interrelate, and you start to build what a story is. When you get that nailed down and everything's logically and internally consistent, you try and make a scenario out of it. So a scenario is a way of anticipating. It's not predictive. You're not forecasting with a scenario. You're trying to create a set of options, what might happen, and make it useful in business planning or in anticipating what's going to happen. So I prefer, instead of saying strategic planning, since we live in a complex world in which planning seems to get thrown out before it can be come to fruition, I like to call it strategic anticipation, being ready for what might happen rather than planning for what you're probably erroneously convinced will happen. So a scenario is a kind of historical memory of the future. It's something that you can sit down and read and say, this is a consistent story about what might happen. I remember, in a certain way, having read it, that this is a future thing. Experience tells us that 4 scenarios, 4 different options for the future, work the best. 2 is okay. The problem with 3 is that there was an exercise once I think in Thailand, where they said, well, let's get a group together and decide what would be the best future for Thailand, the worst future for Thailand, and what they think is probably in the middle somewhere. And everybody gravitated toward the middle one. So you want to challenge people by creating a number of scenarios that don't allow for that kind of black hole gravity well into which people tend to fall. You also don't want to create scenarios about what you hope will happen. If you think about thinking about the future, there's a certain time horizon up to which you can be fairly confident that you can forecast. That there's a high degree of certainty or a low degree of uncertainty, and a fairly high number of predetermined things that you're pretty sure will happen. But there comes a point where those things begin to decay. Uncertainty increases, and the predetermineds begin to disappear. The possibility of surprises increases. Things come out and blindside you. And that's the area where you want to start thinking about scenarios where you create alternatives. There's another breakpoint further beyond that where you move into the realm of hope. Scenarios aren't going to help much there. Nothing will. Usually these things are a few pages long. Too long and you lose people's attention. Too short and they don't contain enough of a story. They're always the ones I've seen written in third-person point of view. I'm going to give you an example at the end of a couple of paragraphs from a scenario and a couple of paragraphs from what I'm adding to this. But they require constant revision because the future never gets here and it's constantly changing. So revising the scenarios or throwing them out and starting over is an unending process. Okay, so it worked. This is the easy way to start building a scenario. Just make a foursquare. Start with something low in the lower corner and something high in the upper and outer corners, and see if they fall into 4 different kinds of stories. So, as an example, we did a project a couple of years ago looking at the evolution of consumer technologies, particularly computers and things like this. So we have low integration of devices, that is, lots of different kinds of devices in the lower left. And the origin of the content for these devices moving from externally developed, Disney develops all the content for your Palm Pilot, to self-generated. So you have 2 coordinates, and you can find your own, and you try to figure out what kinds of things you'll get. And this is what we came up with. The top row is called the box. Everything gets integrated into one box. The turbocharged couch potatoes, which was the title of that scenario, were the people who had big screen TV, web access, telephone, internet, everything all hooked up in one box with a giant remote control device, I suppose. And most of the content is downloaded via satellite, cable, whatever, and pumped into your brain. The right side, where you have self-generated content, you have everybody's a producer. We have access to digital video, audio. We create our own content, ship it via email or over the internet. And so everybody is now beginning to produce high-quality content. Lower left, pocket watchers, ubiquitous devices, but full of little handheld TVs or Palm 7, I guess, as you could call one of the pocket watcher devices, where you're connected to a source of information, but it's pumped out to you. It's not generated by you. And the mobile sociables are the cell phone pager, Palm Pilot beaming crowd, festooned with an exoskeleton of media devices, which I sometimes feel like I am. So then you start to build a scenario. You start to tell a story about what these things are, and you want to push the story out. You want to make it challenging. Not the obvious stuff, but try to make it extreme, so that when you think about the future, you may decide that one or more of these are not likely, and you throw them out. But you need to push that and challenge it before you can decide that. The fact of the matter is that none of these are going to take over, it looks like. They're all going to happen, and then it's a question of where the weight falls, what's the largest of these domains. And if you're in a technology business, this is significant. But that's just one. Wait a minute, did I skip? Yeah, okay. So what I've done with scenarios now is to add what I call vignettes. And these are not the high-level, third-person summary stories that scenarios are. And most of you, if you've read scenarios, know that they describe the world. They say in 2004, the oil economy collapsed and global warming took off, and these 3 or 4 major events happened, and the world begins to look like this. And as a result, regulations came in and did that, and so on. You get this kind of overview. Vignettes are something that we started to develop about 5 years ago as little short scenes, little pieces of story that happen inside. We did them inside some reports as a way of illustrating significant points. The first project we did actually was a study of how people use technology in the household in Silicon Valley. And we came up with about 18 sort of lessons that came out of some ethnographic interviews. The one I remember best is that a lot of people were acquiring technology as a kind of social plumage. They weren't actually using the technology that much, but they liked to have it sitting around so that people would admire them for it. And a couple of years later, we did a global survey like this. And we did some ethnographic interviews in a number of different countries, one of which was Chile. And one of the researchers there reported that it's illegal to speak on a cell phone while you're driving in Chile. And fully 30% of the people arrested for speaking on a cell phone while driving were using a fake cell phone. So that's an illustration. That's a little story as an illustration of how people use technology as plumage. But if you were to create a vignette around that, you would actually have a character in the scene, and you would see the stuff happening. But vignettes as storytelling, is with characters and all the other stuff, is a way of transmitting cultural information. People learn in different ways. There are people who are very fond of graphs and charts and learn a lot from them. And there are other people who like to read analysis. But some people like stories, and I'm one of them, so it's fun for me to do it. And they're also more emotionally compelling, at least for me, than graphs and charts. I'm not a data person. So what is a vignette? It's a short scene. Originally we kept them to less than a page. It presents a problem. The character has to overcome something. There's some challenge that has to be met. These are basic storytelling elements. It illustrates an important point in the scenario, so that the vignettes become a kind of illustration. They'd be like a cartoon panel of various aspects of the scenario itself. It shows characters interacting with each other, real people in real situations, doing human things. They use dialogue. People talk to each other. There's communication going on. They contain emotion, and for me the most important reason to use these things is they reveal the human meaning of this overview scenario that you've created. They show how it affects people's lives. So now a little bit about story structure. I love this because it's a formula. It's E causes P to desire G. But this is basic story structure. This goes back to Aristotle. Some event happens that causes a person to want to achieve a goal. That's why we identify with characters in TV shows and novels and movies. And basically what happens in a story is P tries to get G until P gets it or gives up or gets run over. Okay, now it gets a little complicated with the graphics here, but this is fun to do. There are 4 major characters in any story. And a satisfying and successful story will have all 4 of them. And I use this a lot now because it's turned out to be an extremely useful tool. The protagonist, who is the main character, the hero, the star of the story, is in pursuit of the goal and is trying to figure out how to achieve the goal, how to get it, how to break into the bank vault or get the girl or whatever. The antagonist, that's Luke Skywalker, by the way, in case you wondered. The antagonist is obviously in opposition to the protagonist and is trying to block the protagonist achieving that goal, or to force the protagonist to don't consider how to do it, don't figure it out, or reconsider. There are 2 characters who are orthogonal to those in opposition to each other. The one on the left is the guardian, Obi-Wan, helping the protagonist, but also a kind of conscience, a character who tries to keep the protagonist on the straight and narrow. And opposing that is the thief, who is trying to hinder and tempt. You'll see the use of this in a minute. But the antagonist is the Empire, and the thief is actually Darth Vader, come over to the dark side, trying to tempt the protagonist off of the path of towards the goal. And I've added this stuff about past-oriented stability and future-oriented change because I think when you're doing scenarios, this is useful to think about. The antagonist is trying to keep the status quo, maintain things the way they are, stop the protagonist from making the change. The guardian represents tradition, represents values, helping, but still representing some kind of past. The thief is trying to change things too, but his or her way. So that the white part of the square is what I was thinking of as the future. Okay, what does this mean for doing scenarios? Well, if you're going to do a study for a client, say, which we do a lot of, then you might want to plug the client into the protagonist role. And let's say, for the sake of argument, that we're doing a nonprofit here. I just threw these up. And so what's trying to stop the nonprofit? Well, the for-profit. Maybe the nonprofit's going to come in and give free housing. And the Association of American Realtors doesn't like that. I'm just whatever. So they're in opposition to each other. You've got somebody who's trying to do something, make a change, and you've got somebody stopping them. Maybe the regulators are on the side of the conscience and help. That's the guardian. And maybe you've got some startups out here that are not directly opposed to nonprofits, but in fact see an opportunity here and want to get around the regulations. So they're hindering, or maybe they're tempting. Come over and help us out. We're just a little startup. We need some nonprofit help. Now the nice thing about this is you can actually rotate this. You could put the regulators up in the top as the protagonist, but I just substituted a couple of others. Let's say your client is a startup, or your business is a startup, and you're worried about how this story might unfold. Then you plug in different characters around this quad. It's very useful because any good story has to have all 4. And it's interesting that it falls out in the same as the Foursquare. 4 scenarios and 4 characters. So if you figured out what the 4 major players are, you could rotate them around and create 4 different stories with a different protagonist. Okay, drama. Drama has a curve. I'm going to go through this fast. There's an initial situation. That's the event that triggers P to want G. There's a setting. There's a place. This is why it's important, is that there's a real place that has real meaning for people. It's not the world. It creates a theme. Why are we doing this? What's the message? What domain are we talking about? Is this the ecology of the world, or are we talking about markets? What thematically are we looking at? There's an episode. Something happens. Again, the episode has a setting and a problem. And then there's a resolution. Does P get G or not? A little complicated. But this is just a graphic depiction of those points. The story includes all of them. So it has the 4 characters, and it has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It's very convenient. It's a nice 3-act structure. Any book on screenwriting will tell you, and they all have 3 acts. This goes back to Aristotle. And I don't believe the hypertext postmodernists say that you don't have to have them. I think they're important. So you have an initial situation, you have an episode, or maybe a series of episodes, which are like fractals. They're like small versions of the overall story. And you have a resolution and a conclusion. And down at the bottom you see the state of the world. Sometimes the state can go negative on you. P gives up or gets run over by a bus. Okay, so I thought I'd finish just with a little quote from one scenario from Peter Schwartz's book, The Art of the Long View. This is from a scenario called Change Without Progress. The change without progress scenario is the dark side of market world, a future of chaos and crisis in which people see themselves as the Lone Ranger fighting the system, and the system falls apart. It's a future similar to the world of the movie Blade Runner. Here is a world with fast-paced economic activity, but in which ruthless self-interest and corruption run rampant. Social conflict, a widening gap between those who've made it and those who are permanently locked out, and environmental decay are all commonplace. Economic volatility and a disdain for the welfare of average people color public policy and corporate practice. There's little threat of big wars. Imagine global gang wars instead. Small, short-lived, incoherent fights born more out of pride and bad temper than conflicts of real interest. The principle that the enemy of my enemy is my friend dominates international politics. Instead of rigid alliances, there are quick-paced, uneasy, tense marriages of convenience, and so on. You get it's just the flavor of this. It's an overview, high-level, fast-paced summary, third person, no characters. Okay, this is from a project we did last fall. We were trying to look at technology about 20 years out, so this is set in 2020. There were 4 of these stories. We're now doing vignettes that are now actually short stories. This was more like 4 or 5 pages long. This was, well, what's the dark side? And we were looking at biotech, and this is a story about gene hacking. What are teenagers going to be doing in 2020? They probably won't bring down Yahoo, they'll do something else. So this is Columbine, the next generation. Jose Stuart Nakato and Billy Ahmed Han hacked into the gene bank early Saturday morning before any of the watchdog agents were back from the subway attack in Paris, which had rubbed them half over the wrong way. First, whoever did it had hacked a bug that ate polymer insulation and then decomposed, leaving nothing but a few traces of organic molecules. That was one bitchin' bug, and you had to admire. Second, the electrical shorts fired off a number of microwave frequencies, disrupting not only communications channels, but all sensor traffic in the 16th arrondissement, and that was cool too. What wasn't cool was people got killed and hurt. Very, very uncool. Stewart, a.k.a. Demo Man, resented it. Billy, he said, as the two of them crouched beside a junction box at the edge of their Buenos Aires neighborhood, "We have to do this right." "Yeah, we got to show 'em," Billy said. As the youngest, he was keeping watch. The soft air hiss of high-speed vehicle traffic was only centimeters away on the other side of the wall. And the story goes on. You see what they do. But again, the flavor there is what I was after. It's trying to make it personal, make it real, make it into a story. So that's what I have to say about scenarios. Are there any questions on that? Yeah.
Are you concerned at all about people reading a story and being unhappy maybe about the style and the nuances and kind of overlooking the point, which is the scenario that you're putting together?
No. No, I'm a good writer. I think if it's done right, the point of it makes the impression. What we did at the meeting actually was I read these to a small group. We had about 40 people in a workshop, and then there was discussion about the story. So there was a lot of material around it to keep it focused on the story. Yeah.
This is Ray Glock-Grunek. I've become notorious in this seminar for always bringing up law, and I can't help but bringing it up again in connection with your comment about the story being a powerful mode of communication, because the fact that law teaches itself and reproduces itself in the form of stories, otherwise known as cases, is probably the most forgivable thing about the field. If we only cited rules, I think we would have been annihilated a long time ago.
Yeah, no, it's true. I think it's the thing that makes law human, and it's a human activity. Yeah.
I'd like you to.
I'm Nancy Glock-Grunek. I'd like you to say a little bit more about your comment about hope, and I particularly wanted to say that the scenarios are a matter of projecting into the future for possibilities. And the reason for doing that is to come back to the present and say, what are the kinds of choices we might make today that can influence those outcomes? And I'd like that part of it to be explicit and linked to the notion of, you sort of treated hope like that's way in the future when everything is so misty
notice I
that
didn't give you a time frame, so.
all you've got left is hope. But I'd like you to, can the hope come back into the scenarios as one of the compelling drivers of the choices that we make?
Yeah, that's a great question. The hope, there's a time frame beyond which you're speculating, right? And we don't know what that time frame is. What we do at the Institute is try to go 5 to 10 years and sometimes 20. In 20 years, who remembers what we said? But the Institute has been putting out a 10-year forecast for 21 years now. So we've outlived the first 10 forecasts. And the results have been actually pretty good. The whole point of doing the scenarios is to make good decisions today. And that means, to paraphrase an anthropologist friend of mine who said, the stories we tell about the past are a way of understanding the social reality of the present. You know, I say the stories we tell about the future are also a way of understanding the social realities of the present. They don't really tell us about the future, but they tell us how we feel about it. And they hopefully help us make better decisions today.
We have to.
And I'm getting the...
Yes. I think we better set you up right away. We're running short in time, and so I'll just introduce the next speaker, Norman McCachran from SRI, who is going to be talking about benchmarking, which
hopefully it's there. So we'll first find out whether we have it. Yes, I think we do. Totally different color.
What's the plan time-wise? He goes, and then I get maybe something right.
And the microphone. That's the other thing.
that's what I'm missing.
Okay. One of the things that Doug mentioned in his prepared remarks that I found interesting was the importance of, in effect, learning from the activities and successes of today and, in effect, running experiments. Part of the challenge that he mentioned about laboratory scale experiments is the low level of complexity in which the events are taking place and the difficulty of, in effect, replicating some of the information generated in a social setting there for a larger environment. There's another approach which I've run a lot at SRI over the last 20 years, which tries to get information directly from those highly complex environments by, in effect, treating each organization as a series of natural experiments in performance. In effect, trying to identify, I think I may be not quite, there we are, trying to identify the good performers from a particular point of view, say I'm working with a technology company that wants to identify how to do product development more quickly, which was a classic series of those benchmarking activities in the late 80s and early 90s. And so they take a look at companies that seem to be bringing products to market pretty well, and they ask us to do a survey across those companies to say what practices are those companies undertaking that really allow them to bring things to market more quickly. So what we end up doing is looking at the organizations, discerning what are the critical factors in speed to market, if that's the subject, and then looking at the combinations of practices that seem to characterize those companies that are actually more effective in bringing products to market quickly. So that's an example of benchmarking to identify good practices, taking, in effect, the working organization as a laboratory through comparison rather than trying to do it through a controlled experiment. So that's why I call it natural experiments. I suppose my spiritual progenitor on this one is Donald Campbell. What we're looking at then is identifying best practices as a tool for systematic improvement. If we are looking, in fact, at how to bring new products to market, that might be called sort of a level 1, but we could equally well, and we have, looked at things like how to manage and improve the quality of the product that you're delivering, which is in effect looking at how organizations manage an improvement community. So there are various ways in which you can do this. So the focus of the best practice can vary from level to level. So this same activity of benchmarking can apply as well to the improvement community as it can to a fundamental practice in delivering products or managing technology. Today, because of this being perhaps the most recent large-scale benchmarking study, I'm going to bring the focus onto a particular area of practice, which is the variety of things that companies have found to effectively manage their technology, including the knowledge base for that technology, the repositories. Now, the whole focus of benchmarking, it's an interesting discipline. At one level, it's a learning process. It's a systematic learning process in which the learning is shared across the participating organizations, not just with the sponsoring organization. It's fundamental that everybody has to win. A second part of benchmarking that's absolutely critical is that you have to go into the organization and observe in a natural setting and collect and observe as a third party. You don't just take their word for it. Sometimes the companies themselves don't realize what is an astonishingly interesting and effective and sometimes very simple good practice because they aren't outside the organization looking in. It's particularly appropriate when you want to look at a target area that you understand what the organization that's sponsoring or co-sponsoring the study is struggling with, because once you understand that, you have a better way to understand what's new and different, which could improve their performance. So in that sense, there's a lot of learning that has to take place. But there's another part of the process that I want to bring to our attention that's not explicitly on the slide, but it appears in that second bullet. One of the things that's the most powerful in getting change is to convince people that another course of action is actually possible. And one of the ways you can do that in a business setting is to look at a competitor or a company that is admired by your client in another industry and look for those practices that admired company is doing and bring them back. And the reality of those practices combined with the superior performance of the other organization can overcome the political opposition that says we've never done it that way around here. We couldn't possibly consider doing it that way. You're crazy. And so part of the challenge for any consultant is to become credible. And it's, as the Bible said, my fondest quote from the Bible is the one that says, a prophet is honored everywhere except in their own house. And those of you who've tried to achieve change from within the organization know exactly how valid that is. 100,000%. So to get credence, you have to, in effect, line up your evidence. And one of the best ways is to have a credible set of evidence from outside the organization. So this is our approach to taking this both research and learning process on the one side and political, convincing communication process on the other side, and making it a dynamic, living thing that generates useful results. We've got it lined up as a 5-step, and it all looks nice and digested, but believe me, in doing it in the real world, it's anything but linear. There's a lot of interaction that takes place and a lot of dispute, and in some ways, if you're engaged in a benchmark process with a hot, passionate involvement by various parts of the organization in understanding what is going to be done, you got a pretty good idea that there are some stakeholders out there who are going to really pay attention to the results. The thing you don't want is to have a study that doesn't have any passion in it at all, somewhat akin to our previous speaker. So assessing the client situation, we have these dry words called diagnostic interviews and gaps. That's when you step into the organization with some background, the kinds of things that come about from having done this a lot. And so you've got both perspectives of the past and good performance, but some additional points of view and critical questions, and begin to identify areas of potential weakness and gaps in the organization and start generating a little controversy and involvement. Then you get a sense of what the most critical tasks are. And at that stage, you're trying almost to elicit the doubts and the questions, the challenges that you know you will face at the end, but you identify them up front so that you can go out there and collect the evidence to address them. You don't want to be blindsided at the end by a question that didn't come up at the beginning. Second thing you do is to develop a compendium of the relevant practices that address those gaps and issues and challenges. And you can start from an experience base, but it's very often the case that the most critical information is the freshest from the companies that are regarded politically from opinion leaders as being the best from the standpoint of leadership. So you get collecting information with those technology leaders and feeding back similar kinds of profiles to them so everybody is a winner. Rating the performance against others. This is often the most challenging part from a standpoint of the science of it, because in effect this is a very rich set of indicators and evidence and observations that you end up with. And having to make those assessments is not, shall we say, an analytical task done with survey questionnaires and standardized responses. It's heavily dependent on judgment. So a lot of the richness and experience base of the team that's doing the benchmarking goes into this rating performance. And that is one place where we found it absolutely critical that every benchmark discussion or every benchmark interview be done by two people, two observers. One of them may take the role of asking the questions and the other take the role of recording the answers, but there are two independent viewpoints present as to what's being said and what are the critical follow-on issues to address. So you at least have 2 points of view. Then when you do that rating, you come back and work together as a team to undertake the assessment that's involved. The fourth step is converting the results to an action plan that's appropriate for the organization or organizations that paid the money for the study to be done in the first place. And there the critical question is transferability. In what circumstances do those best practices you found in other organizations work, and understanding the relevance or non-relevance of them for the client organization? And then, of course, there's developing the action plans. Now, even though I spend very little time on that here, that can be a critical step. So here's the flow chart of how this process works. You start with the internal assessment, looking at the gaps and the existing practices that can lead to those gaps, and then take that information to guide the formulation of your external assessment, looking for the appropriate practices that have achieved superior performance by some concrete measurements. Sometimes you can actually form metrics that are beyond just the pure business success of the organization. Other times it's a judgment call. And then bringing those relative ratings together to compare the company with its other organizations in the survey. So this is an example. This is an example of good practices. In effect, we should probably have said we collected the best from each of the companies, over 400 practices from 13 different participating companies, most of which are household names in the U.S. in pharmaceuticals, electronics, petrochemicals, oil exploration and production. The sponsoring organization was an oil company, but had the wisdom to look outside the oil industry because much of what they were interested in was done better in other industries. And then we organized the performance around 8 critical areas. And these were the areas. Each of these had on average about 4 excellent practices that were associated with them. But you begin to see here some of the themes, I think, Doug, that you've been talking about in terms of organization, alignment and direction, leadership, managing the human resource base, information, leveraging and employing technology information, managing, capturing, deploying business knowledge as well, assessing and tracking performance. These areas were basically developed as a construct for saying what do these 400 practices really boil down to, and which are the best of the best, and how do they fit together into a structure. So this is our current representation at SRI of the 8 critical areas for managing technology effectively. But it's just an illustration. You can do a benchmark on any number of different things. But it's one thing I might comment here, in every benchmark we have done, there are certain common elements that appear. Leadership is one, alignment is another.
What's that?
Alignment means essentially the correlation between the activities done on a business level, on a technical level, on a marketing level. Essentially, is the organization all pointing in the same direction, or is R&D off doing stuff over here while the company management thinks it's over here? I remember a classic misalignment case at a company that we all know who's headquartered in St. Louis, where they had a group doing research on a new process for manufacturing polyethylene, and it was a very capital-intensive process, required at that time, which was the early 80s, about $800 million in capital investment to carry it into operation. It turned out that 5 years before the completion of their research, the board of directors of the company had decided they weren't going to make any more capital investments in that industry, but nobody had communicated that to the dozens of researchers who were diligently pursuing this research activity. And it became a total loss and a devastation to careers of several of those leading professionals, because the parent company sold off that unit without being able to gain much from that technology, from a resource, from a valuation viewpoint. So alignment is one of those issues. Another one that has become much more prominent in the last 5 years, which is consistent with what we're talking about here, is the knowledge management arena. It's probably the fastest growing cross-industry concern. What do we have as intellectual capital, not just property in the sense of documented and legally controlled, but also intellectual capital in people's heads, and how do we identify it and bring it to bear where we need it. As one book title I just love says, I wish, well, if only we knew, conscious, deployable, what we know, unconscious, not deployed somewhere. So that issue is very relevant as well in the benchmarking arena, because in effect internal benchmarking helps you know what you know. So when we do these company ratings, we are, as I mentioned before, using a team judgment process, but we find it very helpful and sometimes highly controversial, and controversy is good in this business because it involves people, to put it together into a graphical form. So we identify the key elements, which are shown here as a radar diagram, and then we look at how companies rate compared to their industry. Here's company G in the electronics industry versus the industry average. And the company itself, it was interesting, was good in managing knowledge compared to the industry average, but was having some struggles with respect to leadership and commitment and managing opportunities. In a couple of cases, it had fumbled the ball on some new technologies. So the process that was required to change, interestingly enough, wasn't located primarily in the technical arena. They knew about those technologies, but in the management process that made decisions about how to use that technical knowledge. Now here's a comparison that shows how best practices even help when you are dealing with a company that's pretty good. Company G relative to the electronics industry wasn't too bad, but when you start comparing it with the best of the best, in other words, you take sort of the outer envelope of all the practices and the ratings on all of the scales, you see there's some real opportunities for improvement in nearly every one of the areas. The one where that was not true is where the company itself more or less set the standard, which happened to be in managing knowledge internally and with its customers and suppliers. So one of the things that happens in benchmarking is that everybody can win. The best company in the sample always finds that it can still learn things from somebody else, because it's never best in everything in every area at the same time. So here are examples, and this kind of shows how that chart is a useful communications tool, because you see company G there, and you also see the best company in the sample right next to it, which was company F, happened to be also in the electronics industry and a household name. And one of the interesting questions for company F became, are we actually trying to be too good in too many areas instead of being focused in the right areas to be good in? So it isn't always the case that you want to be best in every area. So just to make some comments about the nature of implementation planning, these gaps that we identify at the front end of the process on the left, these are the critical gaps that we aim at when we try to identify best practices. But then when we come up with those practices, filter them down to those that are applicable to the company, transferable, adaptable, then we can identify the improvement targets. And this shows an example of an improvement plan that's related to the knowledge management arena, looking at some of the gaps that are there, some of the best practices that we identified in addressing those gaps. Now, naturally, each bullet has more rich detail that is beneath it, but we're keeping it at a summary level here. And then, pardon?
We can't see the summary.
You can't see that one?
Can't. It's too fine print.
Too fine print. Yeah. Well, that would be very appropriate, in fact, for our viewers off-site. So let me read through what example gaps were within the original company. Limited documentation, no formal follow-up process. This is a typical problem. Companies neglect to document what they learned from the last project, so they continually make the same mistake on the next project. Reluctance to share knowledge. Does this sound familiar? I got my knowledge. I should share it with Jack. Jack might get a better bonus than I do, so why don't I keep the knowledge here and let Jack stew in his own juice? Technical knowledge not transferred to remote locations. This was a particular problem because this was a global company with widely distributed technical exploration and production activities. And laboratory staff alienated from operations. That was good. We chose that word carefully because they really were alienated from operations. Best practices, establishing knowledge, values, and priorities, using common infrastructure worldwide. It sounds like a familiar theme we've been talking about here, about having the ability to share knowledge on a common basis. Create a best practices catalog, both internally and with respect to external observations. Integrate external technology intelligence system. What's going on out there and what will it tell us about what we need to do and maybe what opportunities we could take by acquisition or purchase instead of having to do our own technical development. And lastly, adapt a company intranet as the platform for distributing this knowledge. So those were some of the key best practices as of 1998 in terms of this arena of knowledge management. Now, we've come some distance in the last 2 years, but in many companies these are still critical areas, maybe with a slightly different technical advancement, but still critical areas. So the improvement plan requires selecting a team, chartering a redesign team, specifying a knowledge management system, and developing a rollout plan. In effect, the standard kinds of management activities for implementation. But now, given the best practices, you're in a more solid position to understand what it will do for you and even to have a series of contacts with those companies who've already done it to say, what are some of the lessons learned in implementation, since you're not a competitor, but you've also done a knowledge management system, which can help us out avoid it. So we've seen one of the things from benchmarking is a community of interest in improvement is formed in sharing practices and experiences in implementation over time, which fit with one of the things Doug had mentioned in his introduction as well. Thank you. Oh, I had better not get strangled here.
I think what we'll do is reorganize things a little bit. We only have a few more minutes on these tapes, so I think if we quit early, we'll get to start early, and we'll have more than just 45 or hour and 45 minutes. So anyway, let's start our break now, and the crew will do their thing, and we'll be back in about 10 or 15 minutes.